Hi everyone, and welcome to the CCS webinar series, special webinar series, Black Lives Matter. I'm Shauna Mottiar. For those of you who don't know me, I direct the center, and I'm introducing Danford Chibongodze and Andries Motau, who facilitate the seminar series. Today our topic is George Floyd and the Minneapolis Uprising. So we've all seen the footage of the police brutality which led to the death of George Floyd. And today we're engaging with Marjaan Sirdar, who is a writer, an organizer, and an abolitionist based in the neighborhood where George Floyd was killed. And he's going to be sharing with us today his observations, his examinations, his experiences of racial poverty and racial capitalism that underlie ongoing police brutality in Minneapolis in America. Welcome, Marjaan. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're so excited to be able to engage with you. And I'm going to stop there and I'm going to hand over to Danford, who is facilitating today. Danford.
Thank you, Shauna. Welcome, Marjaan. Welcome to everyone to our webinar. Today we're gonna have a Q&A session with our guest speaker. I've got 5 questions, and I will ask each and every question, and I'll allow the speaker to at least have at least 5 to 6 minutes to engage with every question that I'm gonna put forward. So Marjaan, thank you so much for giving us your time. In this time of Black Lives Matter movement, which has sort of been so widespread, from North America to Europe, and also seeing it on our doorsteps here in Africa, in South Africa to specific and neighboring countries. So I'll begin with, well, we all know that it has always been there, the movement, the hashtag Black Lives Matter, but this year, under this, COVID pandemic, the death of George Floyd, really, sparked, reignited the movement. So I'm just gonna ask the first question. The first question reads like, George Floyd is not the first black person to be murdered by the American police. Why do you think this murder has reverberated globally in the way that it has?
Thank you for having me. I think I want to start out by framing that question here through the city of Minneapolis. This epidemic of police murdering Black people, especially Black men, is across the U.S. And here in the city of Minneapolis, a small city that a lot of people don't, know much about, we're no exception to that. We've been experiencing police violence for decades here. And so I'll start in 2013. So there was a murder by the police, the Minneapolis police, of a young brother named Terrence Franklin. And that was the first case that I got involved in as an activist. And so in 2013, the United States, we were climbing back from the recession here in this community in South Minneapolis where George Floyd was murdered. We experienced a housing crisis, and we were on our way up, coming out of a big foreclosure crisis. So at that time, a lot of people have lost their homes, and a lot of people were displaced from this community. And this community is a historic Black community. So back in the 1950s, this was the only place in the area where Black people can settle and buy homes. And it's a historic community because it was one of the first neighborhoods in America where the federal government funded the purchase of homes for Black people. So it's been since, in the last 5 years, this community, my street that I live on, has been declared a historic district. But the problem is not many Black folks live here anymore. So in 2013, we started to really feel aggressive gentrification happening in the city and especially in this community. So that's kind of the climate. So there was a new generation of activists who were just coming out of the Occupy movement. And, you know, these are a lot of young college age kids who were energized and politicized and radicalized and ready, ready for action. So 2013, we had a local municipal election. We were electing a new mayor and city council. So a lot of us were involved politically, and we started to see the convergence between political organizing and grassroots community organizing. And of course, the US is different because we have a two-party system versus South Africa, where, you know, anybody with an issue could, in some ways create a political party and a base around that. Here in the US on the left, we don't have a political party that represents our agenda or carries it out. As most people know, the Democrats and the Republicans are both on the right. So at the local level, we started to see a lot of increased activism in 2013 around the murder of Terrence Franklin. And that hit home for me because I was, at the time I was doing youth work. I was working with young people who were experiencing homelessness. And of course, they're almost all Black youth. And many of the young people I worked with were very close to Terrence Franklin. They were friends with this young man who was murdered by the police. And so that was just 1 year after Trayvon Martin's murder, the big incident that really sparked the Black Lives Matter movement in 2012. So in 2013, nationally, there was yet no movement. There was no Black Lives Matter movement. It was only a hashtag. So I want to jump to 2015. Here in Minneapolis, there was a young Black man named Jamar Clark who was murdered by the police. So this was November 2015. So by this time, Black Lives Matter was a huge national movement, and it really sparked a year prior to that. So 2014, when Mike Brown was murdered in Ferguson, which that's when I think the world began to hear Black Lives Matter as a movement beyond a hashtag. In that same year, Mike Brown was murdered. I believe Eric Garner was choked to death in New York City. So 2015, the next year, Sandra Bland was murdered in Texas. They never ruled her death a homicide or a murder. They tried to tell us it was a suicide, but nobody in our community believes that. So I believe that was the summer of 2015. So the Black Lives Matter movement is now a national movement and maybe even a global movement by then. So here in Minneapolis, it was November when Jamar Clark was murdered. And I was in a training, community organizer training by a national organization called Momentum. And so in this training, it was the weekend when Jamar Clark was murdered. I was with a bunch of Black Lives Matter leaders, protest leaders, who were leading the local movement here in Minneapolis. And so this weekend-long training, it went Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And so Jamar Clark was murdered Saturday night. So we all, were at home sleeping. We woke up to the news and we came back on Sunday to finish the training. And instead of finishing the training, we split into two groups. One group split to plan a protest, a response to the murder of Jamar Clark, and the rest of us, including myself, stayed and tried to finish out the training, but really just kind of process what was going on and created a space for us to be vulnerable. So it was that day, it was Sunday, I believe November, maybe 15th. I forget the exact date, but the activists, the Black Lives Matter leaders who went in a separate room to plan the protest, they sparked an 18-day occupation of the 4th Precinct Minneapolis Police Department, which is the home of the officers who killed and murdered Jamar Clark. So I was not a protest leader in this movement. I was a participant. I showed up at the occupation outside of the police precinct. I helped bring food to protesters out there. And then after that occupation for 18 days, a couple weeks later, there was a big protest at the Mall of America, which is the biggest mall in the United States. It used to be the biggest mall in the country. And I grew up just right down the street from the Mall of America. So we had a protest. I participated in that. And of course, the police escalated the protest, shut down the mall. They claimed that the protesters shut it down, but really the police did. In that same, I believe, week or weekend, there was a protest at the airport in Minneapolis. Activists shut down the airport. So Minneapolis Black Lives Matter chapter, in that moment, gained world recognition with the activism and the actions that they were pulling off. So that was 2015, and that was really the height of the Black Lives Matter movement in Minneapolis, and probably nationally, I would say. And then 2016 here in Minneapolis, I was just starting to teach at the high school level. I was just starting my job in August of 2016, and a month prior to that, Philando Castile was murdered by the suburban police outside of Minneapolis. And that, of course, was videotaped by his girlfriend on Facebook Live. And it was just such a blatant case of violence against Black people that it really sparked a lot of outrage from a lot of white people who historically defended the police. Now that we're seeing video of murders, there's really no justification for it. So that was when the athletes here in the United States, including Colin Kaepernick, kicked off a protest that obviously went worldwide and got the attention of Donald Trump and sparked a whole clash. But I had some students that I was teaching at the high school level who joined that protest. So they played American football, and they would take a knee on the football field at every game, which caused a bit of controversy here. And my students went on to win the state championship that year, which was a big deal because it was a Black school in a very white state. And they made, the news for the protests, and they received a lot of backlash from parents and teachers and, white parents and Black parents. So that was 2016. And, so let me back up again, 2015, when the police murdered Jamar Clark and protest leaders and activists occupied the 4th Precinct Police Department, there was a lot of rage and anger. A group of white supremacists came to infiltrate the occupation, and they shot some Black protesters. And because of pressure, we made sure that they were arrested and sent to prison. But without pressure and without activism, there's a chance that the attempted killers at that protest might have got off. But the reaction to activists, people wanted to escalate. People from our communities who were grieving were ready for revenge against the police. They wanted to destroy the city. And many leaders and activists, including myself, we knew what happened in Ferguson after Mike Brown was murdered, what happened in Baltimore when Freddie Gray was killed by the Baltimore police. Both cities were destroyed and burnt. We knew that Minneapolis had the very same potential because of the racism in this city. And, again, this is a city that not a lot of people know about, especially outside of our region, but it's a very wealthy, a very white city. But the Black people in this city are very poor. So you have, in my community where George Floyd was murdered, that was experiencing aggressive gentrification following the 2008 recession, we are experiencing, such conditions where you have extreme white wealth and extreme Black poverty living side by side. That is a recipe for disaster. And we've been trying to organize and move policy to bring equity, to close these gaps between white communities, Black communities, and brown communities, but to no success. So by 2016, when Philando Castile was murdered, so many people were sick of protesting, including myself. Again, the young people that I work with, they were ridiculed for protesting peacefully on the football field by taking a knee. people rejected peaceful protesting. Our politicians really refused to provide relief to the most vulnerable communities, especially Black communities and communities experiencing homelessness, which of course are disproportionately Black. So when George Floyd was murdered in 2020, just a few months ago on May 25th, there was a lot of people here that have been struggling and fighting peacefully. And now we're dealing with a global pandemic. And COVID-19 really, it exposed racial capitalism for what it is, modern day wage slavery. And it really exposed our city and the racial inequality. It made it very visible for the world to see that, the people who had to continue to work and struggle through this pandemic were Black people, brown people, people that look like me in a city that's 70%, 65% white and very wealthy. So, it was the perfect cocktail of oppression with the global pandemic and the exploitation of workers, Black and brown workers, with a fascist president trying to incite racial violence and the police killing of George Floyd. It was the perfect cocktail of oppression that made people say enough is enough. And so it was, the way I tell it is, it wasn't us who burnt the city down. It was the leaders, the powers that be, who ignored us. They've doused gasoline on our community for decades. They gave the police the matches and it went up in flames. And now, of course, they want to blame the angry people in the streets who've exhausted peaceful methods of protesting. So that really brings us up to today and where we're at.
Thank you so much, Marjaan, for really contextualizing the death of George Floyd. Within, you call it the cocktail of oppression. I like that expression. And you contextualize it within the racial inequality that has been institutionalized in America for centuries, taking back the days of slavery, to the Jim Crow era, to Ronald Reagan, fighting with the drug infestation, up until now we are under Trump, the Trump era. And I like the way that you also spell the name of other fallen heroes. You mentioned Terence Franklin, you mentioned Jamal Clark, you mentioned Mike Brown and Eric Garner, up until we reach to George Floyd's name. My second question, we just want to know that there have been various accounts of protests and protesters. Maybe if you can tell us your account. I know you've already touched on some. How was it like in the aftermath of George Floyd's horrific death that was captured on video when that white policeman put his knee on his neck? Tell us about the Minneapolis Uprising after the death of George Floyd.
So prior to that murder and prior to that uprising and the protests, there was a lot of activists that were participating in social distancing protesting. So we would get in our cars and we would protest and try to be safe. So after the murder of George Floyd, there was obviously a lot of concern that there was going to be a big protest and it was going to be problematic in spreading the disease in our community. So I was very cautious about that. And like I said, I'm not one to continuously engage in protesting when I don't believe it's going to get us the results that we wanted. But I participated the day after the murder of George Floyd in the protest. It's, just 4 blocks from my home. So I walked there, I participated. And the organizers of that protest are not from this community. They're from the north side of town. And they're protest leaders, but they're not community organizers. So I was a little worried that the organizers of this protest, who are not from here, from our community, would not necessarily lead this protest as responsibly as we would in our own community to make sure that the disease doesn't spread. But my concerns were heard and addressed, and the protest was huge, but people were trying to intentionally wear masks and be safe. And I would say because the leaders of this protest are not from this community, I think that is another reason why it kind of got out of control. So folks, they rallied where the police murdered George Floyd. There was, a lot of guest speakers and a lot of emotions. It was a huge turnout. There was a lot of people, thousands of people. And so by the time I left, the rally continued and people marched to the police station. And this is when the leaders of the original protest, I believe they also went home, and people were trying to send people home and kind of disperse the crowd. But of course, people were very angry. So they marched about 2 miles, which I don't know, 3 or 4 kilometers to the police station. And this was not organized. So by this time, this is just improvised rage. And that's what we have to understand, is that what happened in the immediate aftermath of George Floyd's murder, it was not organization. It was a lot of angry, pissed off people who were grieving and who rightfully destroyed parts of our city. And they had a lot of righteous anger. And of course, the response from the police and the powers that be were to blame it on outside agitators. And this was a lie. It was manufactured for a couple reasons. Number one, they didn't want to acknowledge, the leaders of the city did not want to acknowledge that they lost control of the city to their own residents. So they blamed it on outsiders. And number two, the police, as many of you all saw, as the news reported live from Minneapolis during the uprising, the police were openly assaulting protesters and journalists live on TV. That is the true essence of who the Minneapolis police are. Like, the world got to see what we deal with. That aggression that you saw, of course, they're not shooting people with rubber bullets or tear gassing people daily, but the aggression you saw and the disregard, especially for Black people, is what we deal with on a daily. So the narrative to blame it on outsiders, outside agitators, was to absolve the police from their brutal attacks against protesters. If you assault outsiders, you can get away with it and say there were evil people coming to invade your city. But if you assault your local residents the same way, it looks really bad for the world. But that's exactly what happened. And the police reports after they arrest the protesters confirmed that over 80%, I want to say even closer to 90% of everybody arrested were local, from here. But they continued that lie. But the question I really want us to think about as activists is, imagine if we were organizing a year prior to the murder of George Floyd, if we were actually organized. And, when the police murdered George Floyd, instead of, just improvised rage and grieving people, taken to the streets with no organization, I imagine what the uprising could have achieved, because we really did not achieve it. We achieved much, don't get me wrong, a global uprising and global recognition. I believe the murder of George Floyd and the uprising changed the world, but we did not get our demands met at a local level because we were not organized with proper demands. So if we had a year you know, to organize prior to that murder, I believe the outcome would have been much different, and we would have saw much more clear rewards and achievements.
Okay, thank you. My third question, it has to do what you've just said about, you know, the organization of, you know, of civic institutions or civic organization. We just want to know, how have organizations come together under the banner Black Lives Matter? What would you say have been some of the challenges? You know, you've already highlighted some of the challenges that you faced in organizing, I think, uprising against police brutality in the US.
I'm sorry, can you, so the question is, how did the Black Lives Matter?
Yes, how have organizations come together under the banner Black Lives Matter? What would you say have been some of the challenges? It speaks. The question speaks to the organizing nature of various institutions or community organization in your city, maybe towards this cause of fighting against police brutality. What are some of the challenges that you are experiencing in sort of organizing the community or rallying for support in realizing your cause against fighting police brutality and racism in your city?
Well, I would say that the number one challenge is racism itself. And many Black people obviously are programmed, just like white people, to believe in white supremacy. So racism is obviously the biggest challenge. You know, when people peacefully protest and people ridicule us for peacefully protesting, that's racism. But Black Lives Matter, the movement here in Minneapolis, it came together because, you know, Minneapolis traditionally has had a very popular activist scene, Black, white, and brown, and everybody in between. So there's always been a popular activist movement, and there's been multiracial organizing historically, which of course is messy in a very white city. And so a lot of different activists from different generations came together in, I believe, 2014 to form the Black Lives Matter Minneapolis chapter. And I think one major issue from the beginning was the generational divide here in the United States. People, you know, from the older generations who still remember the civil rights movement have a much different style and approach to organizing than people from the new generation. And the main divide is the older generation, they believe in top-down leadership. And the problem with that, there's some obvious problems, but the obvious one is historically Black leaders were murdered in our country for fighting for justice, right? For peacefully struggling for justice for Black people. And when our leaders were murdered, those movements fell apart. So Black Lives Matter, the strategy and the philosophy was rooted in leadership development. How do we develop as many leaders as possible, and how do we build a leader-full movement? So some of the original criticism was there are no recognizable leaders of the movement locally or nationally, and people didn't want to take Black Lives Matter serious because there were no leaders who could speak to the movement. Well, that was intentional, and I think people respect that strategy now, and they realize Black Lives Matter became a phenomenon because of that, because we didn't put all this power and trust into a couple leaders to speak for millions of people. And that's how real organizing, I would say, happens. You know, there are different camps on strategies and how to organize. And the camp that I come from is true organization is what happens between protests. Organizing a protest itself is not community organizing. It's an action, building a base of people, of leaders who are committed to a struggle. That's organization. And so it was really after the murder of Philando Castile in 2016 is when that was the last, I would say that was the last year of Black Lives Matter Minneapolis functioning together. After that, they split. And so to today, there's no real organization that carries that banner, Black Lives Minneapolis. And what there is there's two organizations. One is the Racial Justice Network, and that's led by Nakima Levy Armstrong. And so Nakima Levy Armstrong, in the Racial Justice Network, they led the protest the day after George Floyd was murdered. And so they're the group, they're not from this neighborhood, they're from the north side of town, but they are a powerful group. And they would be, in many ways, kind of professional protesters, but they're not really community organizers. And that was a lot of the tension. You know, a lot of people felt that some protesters are more performative and see protesting as theatrics rather than leading to real transformation. And so the other group was that split was more of a younger group. And these younger Black activists formed an organization called Black Visions. And this was led by Candace Montgomery and Miski Noor and a lot of other young Black queer feminists. And so they're much more tied to the cause and the vision of the founders of Black Lives Matter, who are Black queer women, and see the liberation of Black people through the lens of Black women and Black queer liberation. So Black Visions, their philosophy is base building, grassroots organizing, less protesting, more policy change, and we can only change policies. So, you know, again, all the protesting has not amounted to much change here at the local level. This year, we've seen the most significant, not change, but at least rhetoric, right? With the city council saying they're gonna defund and dismantle the Minneapolis police, even though they quickly backtracked on that. But just to get them to say that was huge. And it inspires people to believe that change is on the horizon and that if we keep lobbying and pushing for policy that it can happen. But it's not going to happen just by taking to the streets and yelling and shutting down freeways. It's going to happen by organizing, by building a base of Black people, white people, brown people, native born and immigrants who all have, you know, shared interest in transforming our society away from racial capitalism, away from modern day wage slavery, and really, you know, capitalism and racism, are inextricably linked. And, you know, we have to lead people to this place where we realize that in order to dismantle white supremacy begins with all of us, especially white people, divesting from racial capitalism. That's going to be the hardest part. So I say all that to say that my work has really been in the camp of grassroots base building, community organizing. I work with the Black Visions Collective. I follow that strategy. I'm not a protest leader. My organizing, my skills do not, I do not train or teach people direct action, even though that's part of the work that needs to happen, but that's not my particular skill. My particular skill is in, you know, base building and bringing people together to lead towards action and protest. So where we are today in September 2020 is there's a radical Black network of activists. There are different camps. In many ways, we're fragmented. And the real hard work and the challenge is, how do we align? How do we come together despite our differences and strategies? How do we come together to achieve the ultimate goal, which is Black liberation? And really, it's liberation for everybody. But when Black people are liberated, we believe liberation for everybody else comes with that. When Black people eat, everybody eats. So those are the main challenges. You know, we have protest leaders who are not invested in doing the everyday work of grassroots organizing. And then we have grassroots organizers who are invested in that base building and that work, who aren't getting the support. We're not getting the funds and the resources we need to do that work. Of course, racial capitalism is not gonna fund its opposition to dismantle it.
Thank you so much, Marjaan. I think you've answered part of my second question, because I was going to ask you about your views on how we should organize in the future, you know, against racial capitalism. I like how you frame activism, or how you theorize it. You're arguing that organizing is action. We should be building a base that will eat away, you know, the foundations of racial capitalism. And that base should cut across sexuality, it should cut across races, and it should also cut across class. And you come up with the phrase, it's quite interesting. I really liked it. I've written it down, about the liberation of Black people. When Black people are liberated, when they eat, everyone eats. It's something that I would just pinpoint and, you know, sort of put it on my wall, that when Black people eat, everybody eats.
That's right.
Okay, so my next question, so since you've answered part of my next question, I'll just answer the first part. I'll just ask you the first part of it. Can you please tell us more about your organization and some of the work that you are doing in your city?
Absolutely. So most of my work is focused right here in my neighborhood. I'm a teacher by background. I left my job teaching in the classroom 2 years ago to focus on organizing my neighborhood. And so this year, after the murder of George Floyd, we sprang into action, in many ways unprepared. Who was prepared for a global uprising, right? But we started hosting Saturday community assemblies at the neighborhood park, which is just a block from where George Floyd was murdered. And we had a lot of terrified white neighbors who showed up, more so than Black neighbors. You know, this is not abnormal for Black people, but this is terrifying for white people. So we started organizing in the park. I think it was the first or second week in June. And we were doing that up until just this past Saturday. And so we were having community-wide meetings at the park, and we were asking people to take these conversations to your block. So to have midweek block conversations with your neighbors. And so I led those conversations here on my block, on my street. And we've been meeting for 15 weeks. And the goal is, I've been working on a program. We've been working on a program in this community prior to the murder of George Floyd. And so I've taken this program and I've tailored it to my block and my neighbors, and I'm trying to build a training around it. And what I believe the future of organizing is, especially right now in such a unprecedented time with this global pandemic of COVID-19, which is nothing less than a working class genocide. We have to contextualize that this pandemic has really exposed not just modern day wage slavery, but the racialization, how Black people and brown people are sacrificed, you know, to keep this economy functioning, while I have many white friends and neighbors who get to work from their home, from the comfort of their home, and not lose a penny from their salary. So in these unprecedented times, our democratic institutions have failed. The democratic institutions that people have invested in so heavily have so obviously failed, the same people who have always been failed. And what we have to recognize is this was designed this way. Like, this arrangement is by design. Black people have been brought here to do the hard work, to be the sacrifice, to build the wealth of this nation. In the last century, immigrants have been brought here to replace Black labor. So those protections in the workplace don't provide the same protections that they do. You know, the labor movement. So yesterday or 2 days ago, America celebrated Labor Day, unlike the rest of the world that celebrates it on May 1st. And the wins of the labor movement really don't mean much today. You know, even in 2020, as workers in the past 5 years won $15 an hour wage, that's not a living wage anymore today in America. You know, in COVID-19, anybody making less than $25 an hour is going to be really hard, not just with the expensive rents that we have to pay, but risking your life to do, you know, menial work is not worth it. So I believe the future is organizing as neighbors, organizing as homeowners, as renters, as homeless people. My goal is to get me and my neighbors to form a union here on my street. And historically, I believe that has been it has not been utilized intentionally. I'm not sure if it is criminalized in the United States, but there's a lot of anti-union policies to prevent people from doing things such as this. But if neighbors begin to unionize in their homes and on their streets, much like in the past how we've done in the profession, in our workplaces and trade unions, we build in a much more urgent sense of protection. We build in protection that is much more, it provides so much more insurance than other protections. So for example, I have a neighbor who's facing foreclosure. In just 2 months, they have to leave their home. But if we have, you know, a dozen or more neighbors that form a union and we build a pact to protect one another from displacement, at least during the unprecedented time of COVID-19, where if people get displaced and they get put out of their homes on the streets, it's a death sentence. It is a death sentence. And it's going to be Black people and brown people who are disproportionately displaced because of the evils of racial capitalism. So my goal is, how do we begin to formalize as neighborhoods and unionize on our streets? After the murder of George Floyd and the uprising, our neighbors were terrified that this community was going to burn to the ground. The powers that be, including the police, told everybody that white supremacists from the outside were going to come and hijack the movement and burn down our neighborhoods, and people were terrified. And our biggest fears were that people were going to turn on each other and everybody was going to turn into the police, and that would be a recipe for disaster. So we had to organize one another. We had to bring people together and build relationships. And the only way racial capitalism has been able to thrive, as long as it has, is by breaking down community. Here in America in 2020, neighbors do not talk to one another. I mean, obviously it depends on the neighborhood and the community and the city you live in, but it's very common to build a community without having relationships with one another. So you know, it's a false sense of community. You know, our whole society is designed to keep people working for low wages, to keep us indebted to our landlords and to these banks, and to not question the powers that be. The most activism you'll get from your average American is they will vote. And it's crazy. It's insane that, you know, they don't understand how we got here, how we arrived in this moment with a fascist dictator who is openly inciting race war and civil war, a global pandemic, great inequality, but it was designed this way. Our society was designed for people to not do anything, to not be active, to not critically question our democratic institutions, our, these safety nets that historically have failed Black and Brown communities. And so I believe our future of our movement is, it has to, at least in America, it has to be rooted in multiracial solidarity, because Black people are less than 15% of the population. Here in Minneapolis, in our city, we're 20% of the population. In the state, we're less than, I think, 8%. So we're very different than South Africa. We're such a minority. We cannot win liberation on our own. We must have allies who struggle with us. So we have to pull people in. So as we call for the dismantling of the police and the defunding and the abolition of police, that means we have to be leaders. We have to be ready to step up. The system of policing, it's part of this design that keeps us dependent on these institutions and these systems. So you can call the police to deal with your issues. You don't have to deal with them yourself, right? It's lazy. So we're telling people that we have to actually participate in our communities. We have to build relationship with our neighbors, and we have to rearrange and restructure our society that allows people to do that doesn't work people to death 40, 50, 60 hours a week. It's very intentional that we don't have leisure time for activism. We barely have leisure time for one another, for our families. So of course, we don't have leisure time for activism, and we have to completely restructure society so people work less, and people are unionizing and building relationships and building power right here at home. I know too many people who organize as a profession but fail to do it in their real personal life or in their own community. So I think that's the future. We have to bring this work home. Organizing has to start in your household. If you can't organize your own people, your own family, and I tell this to white people, if you can't address racism in your home and within yourself, how do you expect to address racism in our community or in our society? And if you can't address it in your own neighborhood, how do you expect to change a nation? But I'm hoping we here in my community, we can build a model of neighborhood unionizing that other communities could use and that we could spread.
Sorry about that, Marjaan.
I'm charging my phone. I'm sorry, and I dropped it.
All right. Yes, you can continue. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no, I think I answered the question. For me, I'm hoping that neighborhood unionizing is the future of organizing, and I'm really hoping by next year, 2021, we have a model that has spread at least in our city, and I think in order to hold our elected officials accountable, we need to build out democracy more horizontal at the neighborhood level. Right now, if our only options are to vote our politicians out, which we got a whole nother year before our mayor and our city council are up for re-election. a lot can happen in a year. Our city can burn 10 more times, right? So if our only options as constituents are to vote them out in 16 months or burn the city down, we have a problem. And so the future is in organizing at the grassroots level on your street. If you can't organize your neighbors and you can't build relationships with your neighbors and convince your neighbors that we have to protect one another, then we're in serious trouble, especially as America. I'm not sure if the rest of the world has been paying attention, but many of us predict that America will spiral into civil war.
Thank you about that. I think it was Dave Chappelle who said that real change will come from the street. I like your idea on horizontal activism, that we need to organize as neighborhoods, and we spread it in a horizontal pattern, that solidarity cuts across our racial differences or our class differences. So this leads me to my last question. This is a personal question. You come from a long lineage of Black freedom fighters. I am aware that your mother was the granddaughter of the great Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the Nation of Islam. He mentored Louis Farrakhan and also the great Malcolm X. So how is this?
And Muhammad Ali.
Yeah, and Muhammad Ali, of course, the greatest as well. How is this, this background, you being the great grandson of Elijah Muhammad, how has this shaped your thinking and your methods in activism, or your ideology, or your outlook of society?
That's an excellent question, and you'd be surprised to know that many people here have no idea who the Honorable Elijah Muhammad is. Of course, Black people are familiar, but nobody else really knows who my great grandfather is. But it's a really good question, and I think the best way I could answer that is I have many friends and comrades, Black people, who, many of us, it takes a lifetime to decolonize from white supremacy and to reach this place that Malcolm X was one of my heroes as a child growing up. He was one of my main icons that I looked up to. And it was because of his courage and the way he spoke truth to power. And I grew up in a very white city and society. So I grew up experiencing a lot of racism, racial terrorism. So I have a lot of friends and comrades. It takes them a whole lifetime to reach this place of self-determination and believing that we as Black people are just human beings in the way that all people are human beings, and that we have power to determine and control our own lives. For me, that was my starting point. In my household, despite growing up and experiencing racism, from a very early age, my mother tried to instill that in us, that our conditions are because of racism and white supremacy. White supremacy was a term that I was taught at a very young age. So I would say my starting point was from a place of self-determination. So growing up experiencing racism, it was unsettling for me, because I knew this was all by design to some degree, even though as a child, I wasn't quite able to articulate it. So I would say, it definitely set my trajectory in life to become an activist, because it was clear throughout my whole life. I'm 41, and for 41 years, it's been very clear to me that my ancestors did not achieve what they set out to achieve, and that the fight is unfinished. Where to go, that was a hard place, because the Nation of Islam, especially my family, they moved away from the Nation of Islam a long time ago. And Louis Farrakhan has picked up the banner. And I have a lot of respect for Louis Farrakhan, but I'm not a member of the Nation of Islam. So how to organize, considering my family history and that they use religion and spirituality to organize Black people, has been a bigger challenge. But having that foundation and that inspiration has definitely shaped me, and believing that white power is only as powerful as we make it, and that we give our oppressors power. I've known that for a long time because of the people I come from. So it's definitely a part of the foundation of my activism, of how I see the world. And at the same time, it's challenging because of the Nation of Islam, their history, how they're perceived in society. But more than anything, I'm very proud of that history and their struggle for Black people and self-determination. Nobody could ever take that away, as much as, I don't agree with everything their movement stood for. But the one thing that I believe they contributed and that nobody could take away from them is they were fighting white supremacy before it was popular. They were using the term white supremacy and Black power and Black empowerment, and the strategy that racism is more powerful when Black people are economically depressed, and that we have to economically empower ourselves. I believe those are some of the ultimate achievements of that movement. And of course, we know that it was those teachings that inspired the Black Power movement that came in the late 60s with the Black Panthers. So the Nation of Islam, and really more so the Black Power movement, is what gives me inspiration. And that's what I look to as a model and a base from where we organize today. So when we talk about Black liberation today, it's not something we make up. It's not something we define. It's something that our ancestors defined generations ago. And it's a struggle that we have to continue, and we have to fulfill that legacy. And I'm hoping within our lifetime, I don't do this work for nothing. I do this work because I want to reap the benefits in my lifetime.
Thank you so much, Marjaan. I will take some questions from the audience, and I'll also open this discussion to some of our colleagues that are here, if they want to engage with you, maybe on your work and on your ideologies and your experiences of white America. The first question, this person would like to understand how oppression and killing of Black people been during the Obama era compared to the Trump era. Has there been any difference?
No difference at all. That's a really good question. There's no difference in the numbers of killings. It was, common when Obama was president. It's just as common today. The only difference, now we have a president who is inciting race war and civil war. Obama obviously didn't do that. He wasn't as supportive of our movement as we needed him to be, but he's not against our movement. But Obama had no influence over our police departments. Trump has a lot of influence, negative influence. So Trump, I believe because of Trump, they have been more aggressive, and they're gonna be more aggressive, especially on election day and what comes after election day. That worries me. I believe Trump has a lot of power over our police departments throughout this country. But as far as them murdering Black people, it happened under Obama's watch. It happened before Obama. It's gonna happen after Trump. And you know, it's the same thing with our local police chief, who's a black man. And, you know, people, they want to defend the police because he's a nice black man who comes from a nice black family and a nice black community. And it's a trick. And we have to tell people, listen, it's not about him, his family, or the community he comes from. He has a position and a role to play. He lied after his officers murdered George Floyd. He produced the exact same results his predecessors did, the white predecessors before him. So nothing is changing, at least not for the better, under Donald Trump. And, you know, we could put in another black president like Obama, nothing's gonna change. We could put in another black police chief after this one, it's not gonna change until we begin to dismantle these systems. So that speaks to the split between the movement, right? Many people believe if we put charismatic leaders in the front of these movements, you know, that's how we're gonna win our achievements, and it's completely wrong. Our movements, we have to follow the North Star. We can't follow any charismatic leaders. This is bigger than an individual. We have to work collectively to dismantle systems of oppression. That's why I'm an abolitionist. Did I answer the question?
One of the participants here supports your view. Is sent a message in the chat. In my view, Obama was not in support of anti-racism and anti-classism because he supported and upheld racial capitalism. If there is anyone amongst the audience who want to engage with Marjaan, can you please show by raise of hand or so that I can recognize you?
And I just want to comment, follow up on that comment. He's absolutely, they're absolutely right. Obama, as much as, you know, he tried to address issues of racism, Obama worked for the corporate class of America. Obama, he was not willing to challenge racial capitalism. Therefore, he's not really trying to dismantle white supremacy. And Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, if they win and they beat Trump, it's the same thing. The same thing's gonna happen. So some people think, and I don't disagree with this, that Trump continuing to be our president might actually help our movement because he's gonna destroy the democratic institutions that people depended on to keep peace. So I would say maybe Donald Trump has actually been better for our movement than Obama.
Okay, thank you. I recognize you, Mvuselo Dongoya. You can go ahead and engage.
Yeah, thank you, Brother Denford. Thank you, Marjaan. I'm sorry, I'm driving. I hope you can hear me.
I can hear you.
Thank you so much. That was just amazing. Thank you so much. Just a quick question. I noticed in a span of about 5-10 minutes, I counted your mention of the word organizing. You mentioned it at least 15 times. And I am just stunned by this focus on this key idea that protest and organizing are not necessarily the same thing. I just wanted to hear what your definition of organizing is. And why is it that so many people shy away from doing that particular kind of work? And then my second point is just a minor correction about South Africa. We are not a majority. We Black people in South Africa are not a majority. We are a numerical majority, but we are not a majority. The economy, the culture, and everything else is still in very much in white hands. So yeah, numerically we might be many, but otherwise we are the minority of minorities. But still, thank you so much.
That's a really good point. And that's actually what brought me to South Africa two years ago, to investigate how a nation with a majority population of Black people still suffer under an apartheid system. And so organizing, the definition of organizing to me again, it's what we do in between protests. So it's about base building. So organizing is about, it's about building relationships with people who believe in a common struggle, who are ready to engage in a common struggle to win common demands. And, oh shit. I'm sorry. Can you still hear me? I had a call coming in.
Yes, we can.
I dropped you off.
Sorry about that, man. Sorry.
I apologize. So organizing, it's about building relationships, and actually working towards something bigger than one individual need, right? So the way we're doing it here on the block is not just building relationships. We're trying to build membership. Giving people a sense of belonging, right? Black people in the United States, we have been leaders when it comes to organizing, when it comes to protesting, when it comes to activism for 400 years. And one way that Black youth have organized, and it has been overlooked because it has led to much self-destruction, but gangs, the Bloods, the Crips, the Vice Lords, the Disciples, street gangs are a very interesting way that young Black people have organized historically. The problem is it hasn't uplifted our communities in many ways. It has led to the destruction of our communities. But it gives young Black kids like myself, when I was a teenager, I participated in some of these street gangs because we needed a sense of belonging, especially kids like me who I didn't grow up with a father in my household, right? So organizing is creating a movement where people who have been marginalized can feel a sense of belonging to, right? So as you build up that membership, and again, historically, especially like as we examine the civil rights movement, the traditional wisdom was you build movements, you have a leader, then you have a base of followers. Well, that was problematic because once the leaders were taken out, the followers had no direction. So as we build our base today, we have to develop leaders. As a leader, I would rather have a base of 20 more leaders than a base of 100 followers. I'll say that again. As a leader, I'd rather have a base of 20 other leaders to do this work with me, to carry out an action, whether it's a protest or a strike or a boycott. I'd rather have a base of 20 leaders working with me than 100 followers. So organizing it's about base building, and it's about leadership development. We have to have many, many leaders because as leaders get taken out, which it's gonna happen, they're gonna continue to kill our leaders, to jail our leaders, to discredit our leaders. We have to have more leaders ready to step in. And so protesting is the actions that our base is leading up to as we build our base and we get people to buy into the work that we're doing, then we lead them up to an action. But our action will not be successful if we have not done the work prior to that of building up the base and teaching and training the base what we're fighting for and how to achieve and win our demands. So that's what we saw in this uprising. We saw a lot of angry people who were activated and who were pissed off and who were ready to hit the streets, but they were not ready to win, to achieve a real victory. So all we got was the firing of 4 police officers, and now they've been arrested. Will they be convicted? I'm not hopeful. Most people here are not hopeful. Not one politician has been held accountable. Not the mayor, not the 13 elected city council members. Not one of them has been held accountable. Our district attorney, who refuses to press charges against police, he has not been held accountable. So I would say our uprising was a success in many ways. It sparked global outrage, and it sparked a movement, or it reignited a movement. but at the local level, we have won nothing. Did that answer your question as far as my definition of organizing?
Mvu? Oh, you're still driving, I guess.
Okay.
Okay, there's a comment. I think it sort of follows up, or it was previously held before Mvu posed this question. It's from Sajida. There's a need for a critical distinction between planning a protest, that is the action in brackets, right, and activism in relation to organizing to create critical mass who work to dismantle oppression in various ways. So there should be a distinction between organizing and activism. I'm glad that Fuselelo picked on that. Yes. They also agree with Mvu, white supremacy still reign in South Africa because of racial capitalism. We may have gained political power to some extent, but we are far from being free. That's why we've got EFF now, economic freedom fighters. They are fighting for economic freedom. There's also a comment from Erwin. It is funny how the word abolitionism has shifted from abolishing slavery towards abolishing police. This puts everything in a historical context.
That's right.
Yes.
That's right. And I would thank activist and Black icon Angela Davis, who has resurrected that term in the 20th century of abolitionism. And also I just want to respond to something you just read about South Africa still facing white dominance. That's the future of America. That's why I visited South Africa 2 years ago, and I'm so interested in South Africa, its politics and activism today, because the future of America is becoming a brown country, but white people still have complete dominance. So if we don't begin to transfer and shift control of the economy and of power, we will soon become South Africa, a brown, Black majority still ruled by a white minority. So I think it's very important as Americans, we study what's happening in South Africa today and historically.
Thank you so much. Also, thanks to Aziz, you've shared some material on that we will have to read on the term abolition. I don't know if there is anyone. I'll just take one more engagement or one more question, and then we can close this session. If there is no more engagement, then I'll hand it to Shauna so that she can give us some closing remarks. Over to you, Shauna. Thank you, Marjaan. Thank you for your time.
Thanks so much, Stanford. Thank you, Marjaan. That was really, really inspiring. And I think a lot of the things that you've said have found resonance with some of the activists that we work with, certainly some of the work that I've done on social movements, where we've seen co-optation of leadership, for example, really petty tactics that really work to shut a movement down, just arrest the leader or co-opt the leader. Also, some of the remarks you made about not wanting to build relationships, wanting to build genuine membership, and the idea of something Sajida said about the critical mass and about conscientization. So I think that a lot of what you've said has found resonance with some of the struggles we're having in South Africa and some of the struggles tactically that movements and campaigns have had. And just in general, I just want to thank you again for giving up your time and for your very inspiring points and your very useful, the way that you've interpreted your ideas in the practical and conveyed those to us. I'm certainly feeling very interested in looking further into some of the things that you've talked about. So, and I think a lot of people have felt that way. So thanks to everyone for participating. Marjaan, thanks again. We hope to be able to engage with you again.
Thank you. And I just want to make one last quick point, and it's about the term abolitionism that somebody just brought up. Right now, abolitionism it's not a popular movement. Of course, the majority of people still believe in this police and racial capitalism. So organizing is the work we have to do to popularize abolitionism, this work of dismantling white supremacy and racial capitalism. We have to build popular movements, and organizing is the work of building those relationships and changing the hearts and the minds of the people to support this unpopular work of Black liberation. So thank you. This was a great conversation. I appreciate it.
Thanks everyone
Much
for
appreciated, my
participating.
brother.
Take care, y'all. Peace.
Please
Take care.
join us. Please
Peace.
join us next Wednesday. We're going to be engaging with Leanne Naidu. We're going to be talking about all the statues that are falling. So in the meantime, please keep safe, and we hope to see you next Wednesday. Dan and Andres, please stay behind.